Welcome to Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release, a podcast dedicated to licensed wildlife rehabilitators and the veterinarians who support them. I'm your host, Gail Buhl. I have been waiting for you to hear these next two episodes. I had the honor and the extreme privilege of having a conversation with Dr. Mark Pokras in 2024. He's one of the nation's leading experts on wildlife medicine, rehabilitation, and on loons. He's a wildlife veterinarian and is an associate professor emeritus of veterinary medicine at Tufts University. We will get into a deep dive on loons, but before we do, Dr. Pokras and I talk about his unique background and path to veterinary medicine. Well, I have the distinct privilege today to talk to Dr. Mark Pokras. And boy, we have been behind the scenes chatting and talking for a while on what exactly we really wanted to focus on here, because Dr. Pokras's career is very, very, very interesting and has made a huge impact in the conservation of wildlife. So welcome, Dr. Pokras.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Gail. I'm pleased to be here this morning.
Boy, I've been watching you present at NWRA for many, many, many years, and always just absolutely overwhelmed with wonder, and just so happy that you are in this arena with rehabilitators and conservation, and of course Tufts Wildlife Center. So I thought we could just start out, because I'm amazed at your background, and I always ask if you could kind of tell our listeners a little bit about your origin story.
You know, this is one of those things where it depends on how deeply you want me to go and how long you want me to take, because
we got all kinds of time.
I tend to be wordy and a storyteller, which may be one of the reasons I think I make a good teacher. But anyway, I've always been an outdoor kid. I mean, my father was the eternal Boy Scout, and so from the earliest days I remember, I was out in the woods, picking up rocks and looking for snakes, and learning to catch frogs and look at birds and plants and wild edible plants and all those sorts of things. Spent a lot of time in scouting growing up, and one of the advantages I had, other than growing up in a very outdoorsy, nature-oriented family, was when I was in junior high school, we moved to Latin America. My father was working for a food company, General Foods, and he was sent first to Mexico and then to Venezuela to work in a variety of food enterprises. And so I spent a number of years in Latin America. My Spanish is not perfect, but we could do this whole thing in Spanish if you want.
Please no.
¿Por qué no? Entonces, so I grew up, on the hills and woods and lakes of Eastern North America. I mean, sort of New England, but we traveled a little bit in Eastern Canada. And then I spent years wandering around the beaches and jungles and coral reefs of Latin America, sometimes with the family, sometimes with the Boy Scouts. And I had some friends in high school. We did a lot of hitchhiking in Latin America back when that was probably a much safer thing to do. So, I've swum in the Orinoco and caught anacondas and spent a lot of time outdoors. And that was one of the things that I think steered my early career. When I went to college, and I went directly from a very small international high school in Venezuela. We had 19 in my graduating class. And then I went to Cornell as an undergraduate. We had 4,000 in my freshman class.
A little overwhelming.
Yeah, it took me a while to recover from that. And I went in as a ecology and marine biology major. Part of my problem, I think I'm undiagnosed ADHD. I have a lot of interests. And so I'm as interested in birds as I am in reptiles. I'm as interested in plant ecology as I am in birds and coral reefs and climate change, and this multifaceted interest that I still have to this day, I think is one of the things that has allowed me to, achieve some of the things that I have been able to do. and one of the things that has helped me mentor a great number of students over the
Right.
years.
Right.
But certainly one of the things that I enjoy most is working with, students of all different ages because they come in with different backgrounds and different interests. And I often find I'm not narrowly focused. I'm not
Hmm.
just, you know, doing surgical veterinary medicine or molecular biology or something. And because of my varying backgrounds, I can sort of steer the students. This is my 54th year as a wildlife rehabilitator.
Congratulations.
And although I'm not at a rehabilitation center anymore, I advise any number of rehabilitation centers, particularly in the northeastern US. But as you
Hmm.
say, through NWRA and some of the
Hmm.
state organizations, I interact with a lot, not just in the United States, but pretty much worldwide. I mean,
Right.
we have a big Latin American listserv, Latin vets, if anybody's interested in communicating with people doing wildlife conservation in Latin America. But I'm emailing all the time with people in Australia, Japan, and India, and all over Europe and Scandinavia,
Hmm.
and it's a wonderful privilege. I love this. It allows me to take advantage of the ADHD part of my personality. It's a little this, a little that. Yeah.
Hmm.
As an example, when I was in high school and thinking about career options, looking at colleges, I had two things I was weighing. I was thinking about going to music school, and I was also thinking about going into biology and ecology.
Hmm.
I think I chose the right one. I'm not a good enough musician to really be a pro. But the same thing was true later on in life. I graduated from college, from Cornell in 1971, and I knew I didn't want to go to graduate school right away. I thought I'd take some time off, and some people take a gap year. I took a gap 10 years. Um, I did environmental consulting and taught at a small college and got very involved in environmental research, and then decided, well, I really needed a terminal degree and I was going to go to
Hmm.
graduate school. And again, I had two areas that I was thinking of. I was looking at PhDs in plant ecology, and then I started looking at veterinary medicine. And veterinary medicine, I was a very late bloomer. A couple of things happened. One is I had been working when we were in southern New Jersey and I was teaching. I'd gotten involved in some oil spill recovery
Hmm.
issues
Hmm.
on the Delaware River with what is now Tri-State Bird Rescue and Rehabilitation Center. The founder of that was Lynn Frink, a dear friend of
Right.
mine. And as an ecologist working on that sort of thing, I got very frustrated by how little was known of the biomedicine, not to mention anatomy and physiology of these species we were working on.
Right.
I mean, back in the late 1970s, you
Hmm.
couldn't find veterinarians who wanted to work on this stuff. And I kept pestering people. I'd go over to the vet school at University of Pennsylvania or Cornell or things, and they just weren't doing anything wildlife or conservation-y. It felt to me like there was an empty niche there. And I went out to dinner with a friend of mine and I was talking about my difficulties in choosing graduate schools.
Hmm.
He said to me, "Have you ever thought about becoming a veterinarian?" And I said, "No." Everybody I know who took that route is way smarter than I am. I don't think I could get in after all these years. I don't have all the prereqs. But his advice was good. And, although I was working full time and married and all that sort of thing, I went back and took the prereqs a little at a time and applied to veterinary school. And as with many young people, I didn't get in the first time around. I
Right.
got in the waiting list, the second application
Hmm.
cycle.
Hmm.
And that sort of, shaped the future.
In vet school, were there things you pursued, or because they were pretty open to it? I mean, were you able to do whether it was internships or rotations or things like that, that kind of also shaped where you ended up after you graduated?
Yes, everything contributes to everything. And this is one of
Hmm.
the things I often say talking to young people, whether it's high school or college or things like that, is you never know what knowledge or
Hmm.
skills or connections that you make early on may help shape your career later.
Right.
It's that old Louis Pasteur statement about chance favors the prepared mind. I mean, the
Hmm.
the more connections you have to the universe, the more you see connections and the more you can see where you fit in because we're all different.
Right.
I was Zooming with a student yesterday who is in veterinary school right now, halfway through, and she's decided that she doesn't want to do a traditional career. She doesn't want to go into dog or cat or horse medicine, but she's very interested in infectious disease research.
Wow.
Um, and so, how does she advance her training in that direction? And so I gave
Exactly.
her some names and connections. And, I think that's my job as a mentor, is to help, the next generation find their own paths. But you've got to find your own path. I think the only way that one finds one's own path, and again, I'm speaking from personal experience, so these are all my biases, is you got to try a bunch of things.
Hmm.
And you'll find some things you love and you're good at, and some things you're really bad at. And identifying what you don't want to do is just as important as identifying what you do want to do. And
I say that all the time because I'm now at the position in my career too that I'm counseling folks and people are coming, how did you get where you are? And that's one of the things especially with students that don't have a mortgage or don't have kids or things like that. If they can
Sure.
try a lot of things, even if
Yeah,
they're not making a lot of money at it or have
yeah,
to volunteer or something, I think it's almost more important to find out what you don't want to do rather than what you do want to do. But it
it,
helps narrow the path. It
it
just helps you a lot.
absolutely does. It absolutely does. And,
Hmm.
the earlier you start that, high school, gap years,
Right.
college, the better.
I consider myself a generalist because I'm interested in pretty much everything except for football. It's the only thing I'm not interested in. And I probably should be interested in it because my husband likes it.
There you
But
go.
but yeah, I'm the same way. I am just passionate and interested about everything. And I think that that certainly has informed a lot and has opened up, like you mentioned before, opportunities that I might not have seen otherwise,
Sure.
and connections that I might not have seen otherwise.
Yeah.
So I'm very grateful for that, actually. And I'm a generalist to the core, and
Yeah.
I'm proud of it.
As I advise students, some of them are generalists and
Hmm.
some of them are all, but you also get these students who are very narrowly focused and love what they're doing,
Hmm. Hmm.
and they know from the time they're in eighth grade,
Right.
that they want to be a molecular biologist and play with
Hmm.
DNA, or or they want to be Jane Goodall and go out in the woods and
Right. Right.
what behavioral ecology or something like that.
Right. And more power to him. I've only met one person that was truly like that. It's my nephew.
Yeah,
And when he was, as soon as he could talk, he wanted to be an aerospace engineer.
sure.
And that's what he is. He's an aerospace
Yeah,
engineer
yeah,
and he
yeah,
loves it. Yeah. No, not me.
yeah. Well, and
I want to do everything.
there's room in the universe for all
Hmm.
of that.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the exercise in life is figuring it out. I mean, I'm now 75 and retired,
Hmm.
and I'm still saying, well, what do I want to be when I grow up?
Right.
I
Yeah, I think
there's
that's an
still,
amazing place to be.
there's still so damn much to learn.
Hmm.
We were talking before about my varied interests and how things fit together during a
Right.
career. I mean, what I've done, in more and more, I think in the last few decades is more pathology and
Okay.
forensic stuff. And it's amazing how things add up. I mean, I
Hmm.
could be doing a necropsy on a dead whale or a dead loon or a dead bald eagle or something like
Hmm.
that. Most pathologists don't take x-rays. That
Oh,
that's
huh.
that's a huge mistake.
Right.
Because as a clinician, I know that there's stuff you can see on X-ray that you may not see when you open up,
Right.
or there's things that may be old business, like a healed fracture,
Hmm.
and a pathologist could miss that if it's not
Right.
something recent and so I think integrating the clinical stuff helps. And the other thing, of course, is sometimes you'll get in a body
Hmm.
for a post-mortem, and it's been out there in the environment,
Hmm.
and it's got leaves on it. Well, for the most part, I know what those leaves are.
Right.
And so I can tell, well, this animal was found in a freshwater marsh, in the shallows near
Hmm.
cattail, something of that nature. And so it gives you more information on the case, which can
Right.
influence your decision making.
Right. It's all that forensics type of information that, yeah, that just really informs. Like, even when I get in an animal in that has fly strike or maggots, it's like,
Sure.
I know how old these maggots are, so I know at
Right,
least,
right.
I can back it up at least that far. So,
Sure.
yeah, I think, oh my
Yeah.
gosh,
And
yeah,
of course,
having all that
yeah,
information is
we could
important.
spend an hour. I mean, there's a whole science, and you've probably seen some of the publications on, particularly in human medicine, how bodies decay and
Yes,
yeah,
so
which
interesting.
bacteria and which fungi and which beetles and things like that,
Hmm.
which stages. Yeah, and the FBI runs a body farm for those
Oh,
kinds of
right,
things.
right.
And
I mean, yes, we may have to do that on another podcast because so interesting. Once you graduated, now you stayed with Tufts.
I was one of the unusual students. We were talking before. You know,
Hmm.
I being in wildlife and conservation, I'm innately a generalist, but I
Right.
entered veterinary school, unlike most of my classmates, in that I knew coming in the door that I didn't want to do domestic animals.
Hmm.
You know, I mean, if I needed to, I probably could have made a living doing that. There's plenty of
Right.
jobs out there, but I
Hmm.
knew I wanted to do wildlife. So I was automatically sort of the weird one out. You know, some veterinary students who want to do wildlife are disappointed by the curriculum because they say all we're doing is learning about cats and dogs and horses and cows. And that's
Hmm.
true in
Right.
veterinary school. You know,
Hmm.
90 something percent of the curriculum is domestic animals. But you have to sit back and you say, well, you know, a dog is really a wolf, is really a fox. You know,
Exactly. And the
and a
cat
cat,
is, yeah,
there's only
bobcat.
27,
Hmm.
28 species of cats. They're all basically the same, whether
Hmm.
they're a 2 pound cat or a 450 pound cat.
Right.
It's a
Right.
cat. There's some generalizations. There are only so many different kinds of vertebrates. So I think I went in, I enjoyed it all because
Right.
I was constantly taking this comparative stuff, and they'd lecture us about one species, and then I'd go home and read about the other species. And
Right.
I was the weird one who sat in class and always raised my hand, and the teacher would be talking about something, and I'd say, "Well, what about animals with a three-chambered heart?"
Yeah. I would probably do very similar things for me. And I think probably for you with your background too, and especially how you were comparative and everything is I'm all about natural history and as much
Sure.
as possible, that helps inform lots of the things with wildlife. So I could see you bringing that a lot into the work you were doing at vet school too.
Yeah. But the other thing that I learned early on is if you are entrepreneurial, if you've got good ideas and you
Hmm.
can convince other people that they're good ideas and you can write a grant, you can often create your own niches,
Hmm.
or you could talk people into things. Very rarely have I gotten a job that was advertised.
Oh, you created your own.
When I was in veterinary school and, getting closer to graduation, and I knew
Hmm.
I wanted to do wildlife stuff, and there weren't wildlife things out there. And my wife and I owned a house, so we were sort of fixed geographically.
Sure.
So I sort of drew a circle, and I thought, what conservation organizations are in there? And one of them was Massachusetts Audubon Society.
Okay.
And they never had a veterinarian working for the Audubon Society before, even though they had sanctuaries with live animals on them, and even though they did some wildlife research. And so I met with the president of the Audubon Society, and we talked about some of the opportunities there. We wrote a grant to fund me for a year, um, to come on and do
Well,
a study of veterinary things within the Audubon Society. And
right.
it was only a year.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't know how much that shifted the, worldview a little bit, but
Right.
some.
Hmm.
Um, and so while I was there working at the Audubon Society, I was also volunteering at the new wildlife clinic back at Tufts on weekends.
Hmm.
So, I'd work 5 days a week at the Audubon Society doing sort of conservation policy and education things. And then
Right.
on weekends, I'd go back and work with Dr. Sedgwick in the hospital
Uh-huh.
and get my foot in the door because it was a new wildlife program and he needed help. It was growing faster than one person could handle it. He wanted an intern or a resident, but he didn't have any money. Um,
Uh-huh.
and so I went to the dean at that point, Frank Lowe, who was a marvelous, flexible, innovative thinker. And we talked about this, and he said, "Yeah, it would be wonderful to have a wildlife resident, but we don't have any money for it."
Hmm.
And then he said to me, "But we need somebody to teach anatomy." And so we cut a deal where I would teach in the anatomy course and do the residency for free.
Hmm.
Um, So that was only 8 days a week for
Only
a
8 days a
number of
week.
years. Yeah, so I taught,
Uh-huh.
I was one of the instructors in anatomy for a number of years, and I taught the comparative part of anatomy.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, they were learning horses. I was teaching them fish and birds and frogs
Sure.
and things like that while I did my residency with Dr. Sedgwick. And then when we finally got money, they hired me on as a junior faculty member
Hmm.
to work with Dr. Sedgwick. And when he retired in 1995, they hired me on to direct the wildlife program. So it was partly being in the right place at the right time. Partly it was figuring out, even though there wasn't money, how could
Right.
we
How could
how
you do
could
it?
we finagle this?
Yeah. So you created your own opportunity.
Sure.
Hmm.
It's that being flexible thing again.
Why did Mark get into loons?
Okay. Again, the sort of lifetime, when I was little, with
Hmm.
my family, we did a lot of camping and canoeing, and you hear loons on lakes
Hmm.
at night, and it's just a wonderful experience.
Hmm.
That mysterious call out over the lake, and they do a lot of
Yeah.
it at night, and it's just it just sinks into your subconscious some. I
Hmm.
remember one of the coolest experiences I ever had the summer after high school. A friend of mine and I spent a long time. We canoed for several weeks up in eastern Canada, went from Algonquin National Park almost to Hudson's Bay.
Hmm.
Um, and we were out there on an island one night, and there were loons calling on one side of the island and wolves calling on the other side of the island.
Wow.
And it was just magic.
Yep.
But I think from the point of view of, clinical research involvement in loons, part of it was that early experience with oil spills
Hmm.
on the Delaware River, because we get in a wide variety of different species that were affected by oil.
Hmm.
Canada geese and gulls and gannets and loons and ruddy ducks and all sorts of things. And with many species like Canada geese or gulls, if you got them in early and cleaned them appropriately, you could have really high survival rates. You could
Right.
get 80 or 90% of those birds out, depending on the oil and
Oh,
toxicity and
right. Right.
a lot of variables. With loons, it was really unusual to have any survival at all.
Mm.
They were, they're big, strong birds, 4, 5, 6 kilos,
Right.
sharp beaks, really physically active, and they all die.
Wow.
And there was that frustration about what's different.
Hmm.
I mean, to this day, as we're sitting here today, there's not a zoo in the world that's ever successfully kept a loon alive.
That's right.
I mean, the record, Jimmy Pickner at the Apple Valley Zoo, who
Yeah, at the
hatched
Minnesota Zoo.
some
Hmm.
eggs,
Hmm.
and, he hatched several, and one of them lived a year and a half, and nobody's ever surpassed that. From the biomedical point of view, they're a black box. They're a real mystery as to what's going on. And so, the early emotional experience, this mysterious thing with oil spills, and then later on in the, 70s and early 80s, it was after Rachel Carson had written her book, and we were dealing with the whole DDT
Hmm.
issue. And so there were a lot of species like bald eagles and peregrine falcons and brown pelicans and loons whose populations really plummeted. I was up here in New England at Tufts, and we saw a few loons, and we're always frustrated by how little we could do for them in captivity. And one day, a biologist from New Hampshire, Betsy McCoy, with Loon Preservation Committee,
Hmm.
called me up and said, I found a dead loon. If I bring it down to you, can you tell me why it died? And I'm always, I was teaching
Right.
anatomy as a veterinary clinician. I am always interested in these mysteries. And I said to Betsy, sure, bring it down. We'll take a look at it. And so she brought it down. We took an x-ray. We did a necropsy examination.
Hmm.
And we found that it had a lead fishing weight in it. And
Uh-huh.
the tissues tested high for lead levels.
Hmm.
And I said to Betsy, I've never heard of this before in loons. I knew a lot about lead poisoning in bald eagles, birds of prey, in humans, of course, in domestic
Right.
animals.
Right.
You learn a lot about that in veterinary school. I knew of nothing in loons, and really there was no literature on lead from fishing gear. It was all from hunting or from
Right.
paint or from solder or from other sorts of sources. I casually said to Betsy, this is probably a one-off. You'll probably never see another one. But if you ever find another dead loon, give me a call.
Right.
And that sentence literally changed my life because um, I have become the go-to guy on dead loons in North
Uh-huh.
America. We're now approaching our 4,500th dead loon.
Wow.
And so, I've got crews of people all over the New England states who collect loons and x-ray loons and assist us with the necropsies. And, we archive all the tissues and samples and work with a wide variety of different laboratories all over the
Mm-hmm.
US
Mm-hmm.
to do the toxicology and the molecular genetics and the infectious disease work. And so, just looking at one dead loon has just led to this
Right.
explosion of things. I'm happy to be a cheerleader and help people work on this. I am not a toxicologist. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not a pathologist. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
an infectious disease expert. And so, one of my mantras, have you ever read any biographies of Harold Edgerton, who was at Woods Hole for many years?
No. Mm-mm.
He invented the strobe light. um, used
Okay.
used for photography and a lot of different
Sure.
an
Yep.
amazing guy. But one of his statements from many, many years ago was always work with people who are smarter than you are. Um, and so I took that to heart.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I say to people, I can barely spell PCR. No less,
Let alone do
no
one.
less do one. No, my approach to this has been if we see an issue or we see a problem, let's see if we can find an expert who wants to work on this with us.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
let's broaden the net. I mean, most recently, we've got a team of people now who are getting into some microplastics studies,
Mm-hmm.
and
It's very
and
important.
I think we're also going to get into eDNA, kind of figure out some of the dietary habits of loons, look at their gut contents,
Okay.
because a lot of the things that they eat, you can't see large fragments in the
Okay.
feces, and they don't cast pellets like birds of prey do.
Right.
So it can be harder to figure out what they're eating. And I think eDNA is probably going to turn out to be the answer to a lot of these things.
Wow. So one of the things which I think we should define too for folks is you were talking about one medicine earlier,
Sure.
and certainly I'm a trained naturalist, as I'm a biologist, naturalist, that kind of thing. And one of the things we always talked about was that everything's connected. Everything's connected,
Absolutely.
right?
Yep.
And when the concept of One Health started being thrown around or said and things like that, I'm like, well, finally the rest of the world's catching up to the naturalists.
Yeah,
A little arrogantly, but But let's talk about One Health because that's what you're talking about. Is you're talking about
absolutely. Yeah.
all of those pieces and parts. They're all important to that whole.
Mhm.
So if you want to give a definition to One Health for everybody,
Let me do this backwards.
okay.
Okay. I think if you think about the health professions,
Mm-hmm.
they tend to fall into human medicine and everything else.
Right.
And then veterinary medicine is a little bit subdivided into domestic animal medicine and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think the One Health approach really is we're all just living things on this planet.
Right.
We're breathing the same air, we're drinking the same water, we're affected by many of the same microorganisms and infectious disease. It's a perfect example would be COVID. I mean,
Uh-huh.
we're all thinking about ourselves and masking and hand sanitization and things like that. But think about all the other species on the planet
Mm-hmm.
that are acting as vectors for COVID at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Mammals, birds, other species that are part of the transmission cycle for this. Where did COVID come from in the first
Mm-hmm.
place?
Mm-hmm.
Why does it mutate the way that it does? We're dealing right now with high pathogen avian influenza.
Right. I was thinking that
I
too.
mean, there are people
Mm-hmm.
dying. On the other hand, from the animal point of view, this is wiping out entire
Yeah, it's
species of
a
wildlife.
pandemic on a different level. It really
Turns
is.
damaged gulls. We're seeing it kill fur seals in Chile and
Mm-hmm.
penguins in South Africa and
Mm-hmm.
skuas and gulls and seals in the Antarctic,
Mm-hmm.
and seals here in New England. One of the things that the human medical community is panicked about is this is a virus that mutates rapidly.
Right.
And should this cross over into human beings, it's going to make COVID look like a walk in the park.
Mm-hmm.
It's really terrifying.
Hmm.
And if you spend any time on some of the human medicine discussion groups, which I do, um, they are all really worried about this. And so, when we have people doing a necropsy today on a
Hmm.
bald eagle or a loon or something like that, it's not casual. You're in full PPE. You've got,
Right.
double glove, waterproof gear, face protection, boots, the
Hmm.
whole bit, because we do not want to risk having people exposed to this virus.
Right.
And
Right.
so I think, and it's not just an infectious disease issue. One of the lectures I've given for many years, lead poisoning as a One Health issue.
Hmm.
I mean, all the early literature is in people. I mean, there are Egyptian papyri from 3,000 years ago
Right.
about human lead poisoning. There's Greek literature, there's Roman literature. There's Tanqueray de Planche's famous book, was translated into English in 1850, on lead poisoning in workers in France. There's the Benjamin Franklin letter on
Hmm.
lead poisoning in the printing industry. So this is not new stuff. But again, the human medical community and the veterinary medical community and the wildlife community don't talk to one another much about this.
Right.
Um, and I'll give you an example. That first loon that I got was lead poisoning. And so I developed friendships and professional connections in the veterinary world. And at that point, sort of the grand old man of wildlife lead poisoning is a guy named Milton Friend,
Hmm.
who was then the director of the National Wildlife Health Center in Madison, Wisconsin, sort of the acknowledged world's expert on wildlife lead poisoning. And I've got many of his publications sitting here. In the human medical community, the world's expert at that point was a guy at University of Pittsburgh named Herb Needleman.
Okay.
Uh, he's he and another person, Claire Patterson, are almost personally responsible for getting lead out of gasoline. Um,
Wow.
Took them 30 years to do it.
Hmm.
And it almost cost his professional career because he was railroaded and sued. And yeah, it was really difficult for him.
Right.
And Herb's no longer around, but I got to visit with him some in his later years and get to know him a little bit at University of Pittsburgh. And so I knew the human health people and I knew the wildlife people.
Hmm.
I was the Tufts representative for the National Council for Science and the Environment. And what that meant was just going down to the meetings and bringing information back to the students and faculty. It was sort of a transmitter of information. And so I went down there one year because another friend of mine, Theo Colburn, who discovered endocrine disruptors, was being given a big award, and I wanted to be there to clap for Theo because she was just so marvelous. And I got down there and I was there and I saw Milt Friend, who was also
Hmm.
at the, and so we sat down in the cafe and we were having a cup of coffee. And next to us walks by Herb Needleman. And I introduced them to one another. They'd never met, they'd never
Wow.
heard of one another before.
Wow.
Even though here's the world's expert on wildlife lead poisoning, here's the world's expert on human lead poisoning, and they didn't even know the other one existed.
Wow.
And that's what we have to get over with One Health. There are
Hmm.
these rich resources of information and research and everything else that are in some ways blocked from one another because we don't read one another's literature. We don't go to the other meetings. We don't talk to
Right.
one another.
Right.
This crossover just doesn't happen enough, even today.
Oh, I agree. I totally agree. Human medical, we're starting to see a lot more that, the oncologists are talking to the gastroenterologists that,
Sure.
they're doing a lot of that in there. But you're right, it's still very, very siloed and hopefully opening up more with people like you who like see that.
Well, I think what is beginning to help a lot, it's what you and I are doing today,
Hmm.
the era of electronic communication. The fact that, it used to be when I ordered something on interlibrary loan, I'd have to fill out a 3x5 card and give it to the librarian. It would take 2 weeks to get a paper copy if you were
Exactly.
lucky, and now I get on and I type it in and it's in my inbox frequently the next day.
Right.
And we can have Zooms,
Hmm.
many professional meetings you can attend now by Zoom. And
Exactly.
a lot more, it's a lot less expensive in many
Hmm.
cases. And
Hmm.
expense is part of this too. I mean, going to professional meetings costs a bloody fortune
It does. It
these
really
days.
does. Hmm.
Yeah. But and one of the things I am always saying to the veterinary students is don't restrict yourself to the veterinary literature.
Hmm.
Particularly if you're interested in wildlife and conservation stuff, you have to keep your eye on the conservation journals. You
Hmm.
have to keep your eye on the human medical journal. I
Hmm.
read New England Journal of Medicine every week.
Hmm.
Uh, and conservation biology and IBIS and all these other
Right.
sort of things.
Right.
At least, you know, I read the table of contents and then I read a few selected, I
Sure.
typically probably only read one article per issue, but at least I know what's going on in the field. Yeah.
Exactly. And then that just it percolates in the back of your brain. And then when you see those opportunities, then all of a sudden, I
Right.
remember,
Right.
I got to go look that up again.
Yeah.
Or, maybe I need to talk to this person or
Yeah.
whatever. So I
Yeah.
think it just opens
Yeah.
the opportunity. And, we all have certain amount of time, we still only have 24 hours in a day.
Yeah.
And so you do have to pick and choose and you have to be a little selective, but I think that
Yes.
doing exactly what you're doing, hey, I can read the table of contents and ooh, that article really interests me, but even having a general idea of
Yeah.
what people are doing is important.
Yeah. The other thing, and again, I always go back to focusing on students. One of the things I faced, and I think many of us face, it's sort of this combination of the fear factor and the imposter syndrome.
Yes.
Oh my
Yes.
God, people are going to discover I'm really not this smart and I'm really not this good. And,
Mm-hmm.
my whole
Mm-hmm.
career is going to collapse. And I guess I'm old enough at this point that I don't worry about that so much anymore. When I find in the literature that there's somebody doing something really exciting, or
Mm-hmm.
when I run into a problem like with microplastics or with fungal disease in loons or something like that, I could spend my life trying to catch up and read on that stuff. But if I can figure out who's the world's expert on this,
Right.
then I email them.
Right.
It's
Yes.
go right to the top.
Right.
Uh, and so they don't always get back to you, but it
Mm-hmm.
is amazing how often they do. I mean, with aspergillosis, in birds of prey and loons and
Mm-hmm.
things, the world's expert is at Johns Hopkins, Casa de Val. And so I emailed him years ago, when
Mm-hmm.
he was in New York. Was he at Mount Sinai? I think he was at Mount Sinai. Anyway, just emailed him out of the blue with a question and he got back to me. And we have this lovely correspondence going on now. And whenever I've got technical questions, I email him. And
Wow.
it's like he knows it
Mhm.
all. I don't have time in life to learn all that stuff.
Right.
Um, yeah,
Well, and like you said earlier, whether it's hiring people or getting to know the people who are those experts, people who get people in the room that are smarter than you.
yeah, yeah,
And that's okay
absolutely.
because it's not about you, it's about the outcome. It's trying to figure out the answers to the questions.
Right.
And that's for everybody's benefit. I
So
agree.
this goes back to the One Health thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to any veterinary school, and you go in the campus bookstore or the store where the students sell, Tsatska's paraphernalia,
Right.
t-shirts and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. There's typically one t-shirt I've got one. I should have worn it today. But it's got the school symbol on the front and it says on the back, real doctors treat more than one species. And I give that to MD friends.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have a friend, although he's recently left Harvard, who claims to have worn it in clinics as an internist at Harvard. I don't know if he really has, but I find myself gently teasing MDs
Mm-hmm.
sometimes as I say, "You went to school as much as I did." I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
know how intensive. I didn't go to medical school, but I have a sense.
Oh, sure.
All this and internships and specialty training and boards and all this kind of stuff. And I said, and your license covers
One
the face of the planet, one species.
species.
And I said,
Mm-hmm.
everything else on the planet that is defined as an animal, vertebrate or invertebrate, comes under my license.
Right.
So I've got, 11,000 species of birds, 40,000 species of fish, millions of
Uh,
species of vertebrates, you know,
mm-hmm.
it's just, and I'm feeling profoundly ignorant all the time because I mean, we just don't
Right.
know
Yeah.
about most of these species. But when I look at, the human literature, we're just odd primates. We're
Right.
not that
Hmm.
much different than our close relatives, bonobos and chimpanzees and great apes. And,
Hmm.
we all came down the same
Hmm.
evolutionary pathway. And, oftentimes in a zoo, gorillas in zoos have a lot of cardiac problems. And
Hmm.
usually, if it comes to really detailed medical or surgical treatment, they call in human cardiologists and
Right.
human cardiac surgeons because they get to practice a lot more. We have a
Makes
lot
sense.
more
Yeah.
knowledge on human
Hmm.
hearts than we do on
Hmm.
gorilla hearts, but it's
Hmm.
basically the same thing.
Right. Right.
Um, and so this is all crossover stuff.
And I've certainly just comment on that. I used to work for a zoo and we would often bring in whether it was dentists or
Yeah,
ophthalmologists or things
ophthalmologists,
like that to try to
exactly.
help. And
Yeah,
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 and they were
yeah,
thrilled to do it because, who gets to work on a
sure.
tiger?
Yeah, I mean, the
No.
only problem you have when you get a dentist in to do a tiger, it's often a root canal in a tiger,
Right.
is their files aren't long enough to get down those canines. It's like, oh my God, what am I going to? Yeah,
What am I
yeah,
going to do? Oh my
yeah,
goodness. Yeah.
yeah. But they have a wonderful time doing it, and a canine tooth is a canine tooth.
And
It's just
tooth,
really
right.
big for a 400-pound tiger. But yeah. Mm.
Exactly. Those descriptions and the stories and the connections and everything really kind of gives a holistic view of One Health, right? That it's, we have that human health, we have the animals, and we have the environment, and
Yeah.
that humans, because we're egocentric, right? I mean, that's part of the circle. We're not just
Sure.
animals and the environment, but it's those three, and they really help each other if we allow those walls to be pulled down and
Oh,
exploring
absolutely.
it, right, and asking those questions
Absolutely.
to everybody.
Well, and let me go back, I'm going to be parochial here for a minute. Let me go back to the lead poisoning issue
Yeah.
because we were talking before about what are good sentinel species.
Mm-hmm.
Lead poisoning, it's people.
It's people.
People are the sentinel species.
Huh.
And the reason for that is if you think about wildlife, when you see a loon with lead poisoning, a bald eagle with lead poisoning, a cougar with lead poisoning, it's got profound clinical poisoning. They're lying on the ground, they're twitching, they're
Right.
having anemia and diarrhea and
Mm-hmm.
difficulty breathing. They're
Mm-hmm.
really sick.
Mm-hmm.
We don't see a lot of humans, at least in first world countries these days, with profound clinical lead poisoning.
Right.
What we see is a lot of subtle sublethal stuff, like the children in Flint, Michigan, losing
Right.
IQ points,
Mm-hmm.
or postmenopausal women with cardiac problems,
Mm-hmm.
or subtle kidney disease, or many of the things that the human, Phil Landrigan and Howard Hu and some of the Mike Cosnet and some of the MDs that work on human lead poisoning. Because we are humans and because we like humans, we spend way more of our research and clinical dollars on our own species.
Mm-hmm.
And so we know about, the profound effects in wildlife. We know almost nothing about the subtle sublethal things going
Right.
on. For instance, you start looking at bald eagles hit by cars. You know, yes, it came in with a wing fracture or a leg fracture or something like that. But why did it get hit by the car? Well, it was feeding on a deer
Right.
by the side of the road. Why didn't it get out of the way of the car? Well, its reaction time was slowed because
And
it had,
why is that? Yeah.
yeah, because
Mm-hmm.
it didn't have enough lead in it to make it sick, but it had enough lead in it to affect the speed of nerve transmission. And
Mm-hmm.
so its reaction time is slowed. And
Right.
or the loon lost the fight with the other loon because its reaction time was slowed or its vision was affected because
Right.
it's subly. And so we can look at what we know in humans on all these sublethal
Mm-hmm.
things and we can say, well, if it works that way in people, it probably works that way in other vertebrates. We should look for it there.
The other thing that is on the topic of lead, there are now a lot of wildlife clinics that are looking for lead in other species,
Oh,
mammals, like not
absolutely.
like the
Sure.
non-typical,
Hey,
so not even
gray squirrels.
predators,
Yeah.
gray squirrels, opossums,
Yeah.
all of these animals you would never expect it, but part of it is we've never looked.
You know that old, and I believe it's Japanese, that statement about, to the man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, it's the same thing with lead. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, if you think you've got toxicosis and you've got a machine that measures lead,
Mm-hmm.
and you assume everything's lead until proven otherwise.
Hmm.
The problem with that is we don't have similar easy ways to measure other metals. And so,
Like mercury and other things. Yeah.
well, you know, I think mercury is oversold
Okay.
in wildlife medicine. I think there's some
Hmm.
real problems with mercury. I don't want to say mercury is safe, but we see a lot of animals coming in with what looks like clinical lead poisoning. We see this
Hmm.
in doctors all the time.
Hmm.
And you test their blood lead and it's negligible.
Hmm.
And then people stop testing because they don't have a machine on their desk that measures
Right.
anything.
Hmm.
And so often, if you send those samples out for other things, you're going to find zinc or
Mm.
cadmium
Hmm.
or copper or arsenic or one of the other toxic metals
Right.
that your lead machine doesn't measure.
Hmm.
Uh, I mean, the classic example, and I showed some X-rays on Saturday, a penny.
A
Okay,
penny.
that is an acute toxin. Okay,
Hmm.
if a 2-year-old swallows that, it's considered to be an emergency.
Hmm.
If a dog swallows it, it's an emergency. If a zoo animal swallows it, it's an emergency because these aren't made of copper anymore. Starting in 1982, they're zinc with a very thin copper coating.
That's right.
Yeah. And
Hmm.
so, and there, you go to any zoo or aquarium. Unfortunately, at zoos and aquariums, wherever there's a pool of water, people throw
People
coins.
throw coins in.
That makes me crazy. And so then the penguin swallows it, or the seal swallows it,
Hmm.
or the merganser swallows it, and they die
Hmm.
um, from zinc poisoning
Hmm.
from a penny.
Right.
And so I put up radiographs of a 2-year-old and a dog and an eagle and a penguin,
Right.
all with pennies in them. Yeah.
Right.
Just-
Right.
So there's a lot of things out there besides lead.
Right. Think we'll ever get to a point where we'll have all those things on the tabletop?
No,
Easy test? No.
no.
Mm-mm.
Um, it's a business thing. I mean, the company that makes the blood lead testing machine, Magellan, they can make good money selling lead testing machines to pediatricians' offices around the world
Hmm.
because lead poisoning is so pervasive.
Right.
I mean, it's estimated, and I won't get the numbers because I haven't checked these in some weeks, but today, I mean, sitting here, you and me talking, there's something like 25 million children in the world currently suffering from lead poisoning.
Oh,
Um, Mostly not in third world countries, but you start looking at, India and Southeast Asia and Latin America, and it's terrifying. And then it's a serious environmental justice issue
yes,
in
it is. Yeah.
the non-white communities in the United States, indigenous communities all around the
Hmm.
world,
Hmm.
dealing with lead pipes, bringing water into their housing, or lead paint on their older homes. Or many of these people are subsistence hunters where they're getting lead through their food after shooting it.
Right.
So yeah, so that's why lead machines have such a good market, is
Hmm.
there's so damn much lead out there.
One of the things in a lot of the work you've done with necropsies, with loons in
Yeah.
particular, but other animals too, is that there is value in these animals once they're deceased,
Oh
right?
my gosh,
Whether,
yes.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's huge value. Whether, I mean, even the easiest, lowest level is like, I'm going to learn how to do a physical exam and I'm going to do it
Sure,
on
sure.
something that's
Yeah,
already deceased
yeah,
because I can manipulate things and not worry about hurting an animal or something
yeah.
like that. That's the lowest level. But so much, like you've just explained, so much can be learned by doing a post-mortem x-ray or radiograph and then of course opening up an animal, and there's so much to be learned.
Yeah.
So how can a wildlife rehabilitator that maybe doesn't have a veterinarian, they have a center, but they don't have a
Mhm.
veterinarian on staff, for example, that specializes in wildlife, how could they kind of pursue or start down that path so that more of that information gets gleaned from those animals?
A great question. And it's one of those things where I think we used to be much more casual about this. I mean, it used to be at
Mm.
NWRA meetings, we'd sometimes have intro to necropsy labs,
Mm-hmm.
teach people how to do it themselves, sort of at home,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
hopefully not on their kitchen tables, but yes.
We
um,
won't ask too many questions there.
well, I think back to how I started out and I go, oh my God, I survived that.
I
Um,
know. I've
yeah,
I've thought about that too.
yeah. I think, the issue that we face now as we get into some more of these infectious diseases
Mm-hmm.
is there are things out there that are communicable. And so if we're going to be doing necropsies or involving educational facilities or wildlife rehabilitators in it, we just have to do it in a way that's safe.
Right.
Yes, I think necropsies, we're not doing enough of them. There's this old statement that pathologists always tell you, the dead teach the living.
Yes.
So, particularly in wildlife, so often you'll get a rehab case in and you can't afford to do a lot of diagnostics. You're lucky if you can do, a microhematocrit and maybe a blood smear on a slide and take an x-ray.
Mm-hmm.
But being able to send in a biochemical profile or endocrine tests or things like that, once you start spending hundreds of dollars per case, there aren't many rehabilitation centers that can do that. And so often when an animal dies, we don't really know why it is.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way that we're going to get better is to figure out what some of these were and what we should have done better early. Had we known that this was this kind of a case, we could have done that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And necropsies can be very helpful with that. And then the question is, you got to figure out what's right for your facility.
That was Dr. Mark Pokras, wildlife veterinarian and nationally renowned expert on loons and wildlife medicine. Dr. Pokras is an associate professor emeritus of veterinary medicine at Tufts University. I cannot thank him enough for taking time from his busy schedule to talk about wildlife rehabilitation for us. In part 2, we go more in depth into common loons, loon biology, sentinel species, and forensic pathology. We talk a lot about how the dead teach the living, and it is as cool as it sounds. Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release is a production of Partners for Wildlife, working hand in hand with wildlife rehabilitators and veterinarians to improve the welfare of orphaned, ill, and injured wildlife. Our executive producer is me, Gail Buhl. I'm the Partnership Coordinator for Partners for Wildlife at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine's Raptor Center. To learn more about the Raptor Center and Partners for Wildlife, visit theraptorcenter.umn.edu. Our producer is Reese Rosato. Special thanks to our guest, Dr. Mark Pokras, Partners for Wildlife, the Raptor Center at the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Minnesota. Hope you'll join us again, especially for part 2.